A few years ago, I reacted to some scenes in movie, TV, and advertising, knitting or questionable knitting scenes, and you all left me some wonderful comments with some other scene suggestions, so I thought that I would take some time today to review exactly what we are seeing across those scenes. I feel like I'm probably not the only one who has watched a lot of Outlander. There are some really interesting knit pieces in there, but there is a scene that has been mentioned a few times, and I'm actually glad I waited until now to talk about it because I think I have a little bit better background to speak about it. And that is when the character Claire comes up to young Ian fixing a fishing net. He is using the correct tools as far as I can tell, and he is talking about how it's not so hard to fix because it is very similar to knitting. And that made me pause a little bit. When I saw it for the first time, I don't think I had learned how to net yet, so I wasn't exactly sure how accurate that statement was. Since then though, I have learned how to net from a Victorian manual, which was not easy. I also learned from the comments in that video that I learned there's many different ways to do netting, and I was doing like fine netting. But I will say that to me, the motions are very different. You're creating permanent knots in strings with shuttles that you pass through formed material, versus knitting, you have open continuous loops onto at least 2 needles, sometimes it's more, that you're moving from one needle to the other. So to me, I guess there's general similarities in them both being fiber crafts, but I personally didn't find that knowing knitting, crocheting, spinning, weaving, and tatting to be all that helpful when I was netting. Another sweet part of this interaction is saying that Claire was surprised that Ian knits, and he mentions that everyone would knit from the time that they could hold a needle, which makes Claire realize that Jamie would also knit. It's maybe a little bit more unusual nowadays or a more recent history for men to knit, but the men in my family know how to knit as well. I don't know if that's more of like a German thing or not, but you also look back in time and a lot of illustrations of stocking knitters and stockingers especially were men and men knitting, and I feel like the popularity is rising, but I think that there is still a little bit more ground to cover, so I think it's nice to have that be part of popular culture discussion and making it less unusual, let's say, for there to be men who knit. But talking about all these TV shows and screen time, I've realized I'm not just watching knitting on screens, I'm also wasting way too much time on them, especially on my phone. So I started using Scrolly, and it's actually been really helpful. It's basically a little physical tool that lets you lock yourself out of distracting apps until you choose to unlock them. You pick which apps you want to block on the app, tap Scrolly to your phone, and that's it. Those apps stay locked until you physically tap Scrolly again. So now when I sit down to knit, I'm not accidentally watching 5 hours of people pretending to knit and not getting anything done. If you also want to get your time back, you can get 10% off with my code in the description down below. Thank you so much to Scrolly for sponsoring today's video and making videos like this even possible. So let's get back to looking at some more knitting in TV shows. Now the next 2 scenes are going to be a little bit harder for me to talk about. I did look into them and I watched the whole episodes, but they're both of shows that I personally haven't watched. So the first scene is from Grey's Anatomy, where Izzy is knitting a sweater. And I believe another character wanted to knit a sweater as a way to distract herself. And knitting is great. I have personally used knitting to distract myself from things happening in life. I find it to be a really lovely meditation, but she is knitting because she says that she can't see the other person isn't actually knitting a sweater. But I tried to look pretty closely into the scenes of both of them knitting, and as far as I can tell, they are both actually knitting. They knit in the throwing style. I knit continental, specifically combination continental, but there's many ways to knit, and from what I understand in the US at least, it's most common to do the throwing style of knitting. So I don't see why they're saying that the other character can't knit a sweater, because to me it seems like she's knitting just as proficiently as Izzy is. The thing that gets me a little bit, and the thing that makes me question it a little bit, or the statement that I question a little bit, is that when Izzy finishes the sweater and shows it to Denny, he is astounded that she finished knitting a sweater in a day. I find that hard to believe. It is a chunky sweater. From what I can see, it is quite a large gauge size, so that something like that will knit up much faster. But it still takes a long time to knit a sweater. Even on my knitting machine, I am hard pressed to finish a sweater in a day. And that is being at my knitting machine all day long. Like, I'm spending hours at my knitting machine, and I have a linker to sew things together and to finish seams and ends and weave things in. I know that there are other YouTubers who have sat down and tried to knit an entire sweater in 24 hours. Specifically Kika from Kutova Kika, her channel, I know she did a 24-hour knitting challenge, and I don't think she's finished that sweater, and it was an even bulkier gauge, and she is a incredibly proficient knitter. So I find that to lead to maybe unrealistic expectations, because it wasn't like Izzy was depicted as only knitting in that episode. It was like she was knitting and doing her job, which is a very, very busy job. I love that they're actually knitting, and I love that they show a finished object that is knitting, because last time we discussed that they showed scenes of people knitting crocheted items, which is also a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. I do like there to be some accuracy in what we're talking about when it comes to fiber crafts. So I think a lot of people pick up different hobbies and skills or ideas for doing things from maybe the shows that they watch or the media that they interact with, and that could give someone unreasonable expectations for what you could do with knitting if you've never experienced knitting before and you want to try it. And then you try knitting for the first time and you're expected to be able to get close to knitting a sweater in a day. And I don't know that knitting an adult-sized men's sweater in a day is feasible unless you had a knitting machine and you spent all day at it. I'm completely forgetting that last year I attempted to knit a sweater in 5 hours, which I did because it's a vintage pattern that claimed that you should be able to hand knit a sweater in 5 hours. And maybe I'm forgetting it because I knit it right after a wisdom tooth removal surgery, so I wasn't, maybe fully with it. But I can tell you, I definitely did not finish that sweater in 5 hours. So yeah, I think the expectations are just a little bit unrealistic. And I know that there are production knitters and I know that there are process knitters. I feel like I'm a combination of both. I enjoy the process, but I'm also looking to wear and use the end product. But even for product knitters, trying to knit something that quickly is maybe not the best idea for your joints and your body in general. The last scene I want to talk about, and it's not even really a scene, it's an entire episode. I feel quite spoiled that entire episode is based on knitting, which is a knitathon event in Gilmore Girls. And I don't know how controversial it is to say that I never watched Gilmore Girls, but I just I've never watched that show. So having that be recommended to me was really great. And to see, like I said, an entire episode be dedicated to fiber crafts and knitting was really fun. And it shows Lorelai, the main character, kind of training up for knitting. I think that's kind of fun, and we can actually see her knitting. She is actually knitting. Again, she's doing it in the throwing style, which is very common in the US, and it makes me happy to see actual knitting happening on TV. I think the concept of trying to train your muscles up to be able to knit faster is funny, because I do a lot of knitting, and all that more knitting has done is give me repetitive use injuries and make me slower, but maybe I'm not doing it right, because there is a scene later on where there's a lot of background characters knitting, including a really, really solid example of someone who I can tell has like strong knitting skills in the foreground. So again, great to see actual knitting. But then one of the other characters is using one of those grip strength trainers, kind of being like, I'm training my grip strength so that I can knit faster, like I have a stronger grip. And in reality, I don't know that you actually want a very strong grip, because I find that the stronger grip strength I have, it's harder for me to knit because I tend to make my stitches tighter. I have actually broken wooden knitting needles, like double pointed needles, especially the really small ones, when my grip is too tight. And I don't do grip strength training specifically for knitting, but just like not maybe super relevant, but I do power lift. And my grip strength does improve as my lifts improve, right? Because I need to be able to hold onto the bar more tightly. But I noticed that when I'm doing more powerlifting, I break more knitting needles. It's not a very common occurrence, but sometimes when I'm working on the really fine, delicate patterns and I'm using wooden knitting needles, I have broken multiple of those. So just a funny, maybe a little bit more personal anecdote, and just a funny depiction to see in general that they were doing like grip strength training to try to get better at knitting, but I personally have found the opposite to be the case. There's another part in that episode where they are actually outside at the knitathon, and one of the women says, knit, purl, knit faster, knit, purl, let's go. That stuck out to me because I can tell that the people in that scene generally seem to know how to knit, but all the pieces that they're working on are garter stitch, which means that they are only knitting. There are no purl stitches whatsoever. And she also references like work on the ribbing, so they are talking about things correctly. When you knit and you purl in the same row, you are ribbing, but all of the pieces that they're showing are all garter stitch. So that isn't something that is correct to say, I guess, about the pieces that they're holding. But I like that in general, they're using terminology that makes sense. So in watching that episode, I think the only character that really stood out as not knowing how to knit in real life, but being depicted as knitting is Suki. And she generally has a project on her needles and is moving them around, but I don't ever see her like hooking yarn through. It could kind of look like continental knitting, but she's not throwing the yarn at all. It doesn't seem to be to me that she's making any progress whatsoever. I think she generally does a good job of making it look not too out of place or anything like that. I was just very much paying attention very closely to the knitting scenes to see who was actually knitting and who wasn't. I don't think that would stick out to anyone else, right? One last thing that isn't super knitting related that just kind of stuck out to me is that there were some times where Lorelai was working with a swift. She was winding a ball of yarn from a yarn swift, and that is something that you do. I was just wondering why she was doing that. Like, it's nice to have your yarn balled up to knit with. You don't really want to knit from a skein. I know some people do. I think my grandmother sometimes just knit from a skein, but the yarn that she was putting into a ball was previously already a ball. So unless we unraveled what we had knit or an already formed ball onto the yarn winder and then we're going back to a knitting ball, I'm not exactly sure why that yarn was on a skein winder being turned back into a ball of yarn. But I think it was also nice just to get some more yarn tools in TV and to watch her using it appropriately. Like, she was actually winding a ball of yarn from a swift, and I think that that's lovely. At the end of the day, I love when fiber crafts are represented and depicted in media. I want more people to become a part of it. I want everyone to pick up some sort of fiber craft, whatever resonates best with them, whatever works best with them, because I think that it's a lovely skill to have, and it's just super fun, and it's so great. Like, the feeling of accomplishment when you make something that you can either use or wear or gift, I think is lovely. So I think any exposure is great to have. So if you have more examples and more thoughts on depiction of fiber crafts in the media, please let me know, because I'm always like, I love looking at it and I'd like to review it. And let me know if you want to see more like this, because I'm sure that there are plenty more that I haven't covered. I know that our time is precious, so thank you so much for spending some of it with me. I hope to see you all again very, very soon. In the meantime, there might be a video right here that you enjoy watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.